Welcome to the Tenement Museum. I'm Annie Palin, the museum's president, and I'm standing in the apartment of the Baldizzi family. Adolfo and Rosaria Baldizzi left Italy in the 1920s, and they settled in this apartment in 1928. Here, they raised a family. When the Great Depression hit, however, Adolfo was not able to continue work as a carpenter. The family turned to home relief to help feed their children, Josephine and Johnny. We know all this about the family because one day in the late 1980s, Josephine Baldizzi Esposito was walking the neighborhood, coming to visit her childhood home. And she came to 97 Orchard, and instead of finding just the assortment of clothing stores or shoe stores that had been here in the past, now with those stores was also a museum storefront. Ruth Abram and Anita Jacobson had set out to create a tenement museum. Josephine introduced herself as a former resident, and Ruth and Anita were ecstatic. They invited her to sit down, and she regaled them with stories of what life was like in this apartment throughout her childhood.
I remember sitting around the table in the kitchen under the window, and my mother would have made us a fried egg or something on a roll with butter, and my father would put the ketchup on it, and that was a treat every Saturday. It had to be Saturday or Sunday. The sink is where we washed dishes, where we washed our bodies, and there was a little tub next to it, and maybe once a week my mother would heat up the water and give us a bath, both of us, in one tub.
That experience gave Ruth and Anita further determination to do what they set out to do, which is to tell the stories of working class lives in one building. They realized that it's not just the conditions that people faced, but it was what they did with those conditions, how they planted morning glories, or they put up another layer of wallpaper to make their lives better. That is what made them American. For 30 plus years, the Tenement Museum researched, framed, and even staged these stories, creating different apartments in which visitors, upwards of 2.5 million over time, would stand in these spaces, learn the stories, and contemplate the dilemmas that the past residents faced. In April of 2020, the New York Times wrote a story talking about how a museum dedicated to tell the stories of survivors now faced its own fight to survive. 4,000 people responded to that article with donations, and that support was critical in keeping the Tenement Museum going. Tonight, as spring settles on the Lower East Side, we honor you, the 4,000 donors from all across the country who stepped up to send in your stories of connection and your contribution. That support helped propel the museum forward. We'll start by looking at how our story began and how those radical ideas continue to inspire and shape our work.
Ruth always had it in her head to begin a museum about immigrants and what life was like in tenements, because that history, unlike the history of the cowboy in America, had never been told before, and more people came from that history than the one that is told.
Anita and I started looking for the tenements, and we'd pretty much given up because everything that we saw was already too much changed or renovated or closed or whatever, until she did find it, and that was such an exciting day for both of us.
One day I was walking on Orchard Street, and I saw a for rent sign. The building was just unbelievable. It was as though it had been sitting there waiting for us and waiting for all the visitors to come to see it and tell its story.
Then the question was, what are we going to do with it? I'd never worked in a museum before, and at first we didn't hire people who'd worked in museums. We hired all sorts of people, but not museum people, because we were going to break the rules, and we didn't want anybody who was rule bound or who knew the rules. As long as we didn't know them, we could break them. We thought first about composite stories, but then we realized that if we had the actual building, We didn't have to tell composite stories. We could tell the real stories.
So we went to the census and we looked up people and picked certain people that we felt might be interesting to include in our building, and ended up doing research on those people, the Baldizis, the Rogoshevskis, trying to find descendants of these people and interviewing them.
The tenement story gets you into everything. I mean, it's not just women, it's not just men, it's not just immigrants, it's not just labor, it's not just work, it's not just landlords. You name it, and it's there because life goes on there. And so it was wonderful to be able to excite scholars.
Stepping into 97 Orchard Street, I have to say, changed my life. The experience of being in the museum was both of a ruin, but not a collapsing ruin. The higher up you went in the building as you climbed up, the conditions deteriorated. And when you got to the 5th floor, it was pretty much a wreck. But, to me, there was so much there to see.
There was furniture in the rooms. There were artifacts like little American flags, tin toys, makeup, love letters. There was an overdue book notification from the library in the mailbox. We began to put pieces together and really learn about what life must have been like.
To Ruth's credit, her vision was an ecumenical one, that this was a museum that would interpret many different experiences and look at both the differences and the parallels. If you go on a tour that's just on the 2nd floor, you're in 2 apartments that are largely as found condition where you can read the layering of history. And then you're in the Gumpert's apartment from the 1860s. And then you turn the corner and you're in the Baldizzi apartment from the 1930s. It's the continuum of life and experience in this one single building that acts as a sort of stand-in for the tenement experience and the working class experience and the immigrant experience, not only in New York, but elsewhere. Then how that is interpreted to bring it to life is what makes the Tenement Museum so successful.
This building was built in 1863. This is one of the oldest tenements in America.
This museum is different from all other museums. You only can walk through it with a group of people led by an educator. And so what you have is a really interesting way of storytelling that blends primary sources, the shared analysis of those sources, and a recreated apartment space that becomes the stage for people to imagine the lives of the people who lived there before.
By the 1900s, with all of these families coming in, all of these families working, we are looking at the largest Jewish city in the world. We are looking at the most densely populated place on earth. Imagine how it looks outside. Well, let's take a look at what this block that we're just on looks like in 1898. So what I want to take is I want to take this little boy and I want to follow him. Because if we follow him, eventually he'll lead us to Harry Levine's garment factory.
A tour at the Tenement Museum is really different from experiences at many museums. We don't have galleries where you can walk through and look at works and objects. What we have are homes.
What do you all think about the Schneider's home? Tight, cozy. Do you all see ways in which this couple, though, is kind of working toward the American dream or achieving the American dream?
The brilliance of the Tenement Museum is that you can walk literally through the history of your ancestors, the friends of your ancestors, the generations of your ancestors, and thereby you can literally walk through the history of America in a way that's not possible by reading a text.
It's been life-changing for me. To be in this room and to talk about this history, it connects me to everyone I'm speaking to. And when it really works, there's no distance at all between us.
The stories of 97 Orchard Street connect us through objects, through people's lives, connect us to each other.
The Tenement Museum's collection is completely unique among other museums. All of that historic fabric is part of the collection. In fact, the whole 97 Orchard itself is a collection within a collection.
97 is just so rich with those stories, and so with the idea of this relatively simple building, but with all of this texture, with the simple but humble and profound objects that are brought to life by our educators with these amazing stories. It brings all of this together and just creates this amazing emotional connection that none of those individual pieces could have.
97 Orchard Street was opened as a home from 1863 to 1935.
Because the museum only told stories of people who lived in the buildings, it was important to acquire another tenement to enable the museum to tell more recent waves of immigrant stories.
We invite groups into these spaces, into these homes, into kitchens and bedrooms and living rooms to hear the story of someone who lived in that building, someone who lived in this time period.
The first time I went to the Tenement Museum, which was only a few years ago, I was really impressed.
To actually be in the space, to have this very physical, visceral response, to imagine everything from the end of a long workday to Sunday dinner to Shabbos dinner for that matter. It was really incredible.
Every family has its difficulties. Every family has its great joys. And every family from the Tenement Museum lived in an era in which there was enormous social and other kinds of tumult.
In the historical profession, we've been in a very long change in the way that we think about history. So moving from the history of, the elites or political people, and really wanting to understand more about how people live their lives, how those big political movements impacted intimate life, everyday life. The parlors and the kitchens are not just places of leisure, but they're also places of creation. And they're part of the fabric of our world. So it's very important that we understand what was going on in those spaces. Spaces where men, women, and children together were creating what we understand of today as the history of the United States.
When the pandemic hit, like so many other institutions, our doors were closed. You wouldn't hear the sounds of conversation. You wouldn't hear the sounds of learning. It was just a quiet hallway. We had become part of a story of people who had to fight to survive.
I think that when the museum was in danger of closing because its income stream had basically dried up, there was an outpouring of support because it's a story that people identify with.
Well, the first time I remember coming to the Tenement Museum was with my mom when I was pretty young. I was kind of intrigued by how different it was from now, and I guess their living situation and their backstory, and I just remember wanting to go back again. I wanted to start the fundraiser because I wanted to just help the Tenement Museum out. Well, I think that it's important for people to know these stories. It shows how all the people that helped to shape our society now, and even if they were often overlooked or not recognized for what they did, I think that it's important for us to know how our society was shaped.
When we had to close our doors on March 13th, 2020, the first question was, what is going on? What is the future going to look like? And then one of the next questions was, how do we keep these experiences going?
As the months went on, the incredible staff of the Tenement Museum figured out a way to share the tenement stories, share the apartment stories through Zoom, creating immersive digital programs that have now reached every state in the country.
I teach on the Southern Oregon coast in the small community of Port Orford. I never would have dreamed that I could take my class to visit, even virtually. So one of those COVID silver linings, right? A whole new thing has opened up to all of us around the world. And being able to take my rural Southern Oregon students to New York to visit your museum, it was fantastic. They're going to remember that. Growing up in rural Oregon doesn't sound a lot like growing up in a big city. But when you're looking at common factors such as working class lifestyles and the challenges people face and the desire for growth, and looking at all of that, I think the kids can really see connections.
When I think about the future that I hope for the museum, it is both continuing to build and expand and record and preserve this question of what does it mean to be American, and also to continue to expand its reach.
Without the dedication and just tireless energy of Morris Vogel leading the museum through this completely unprecedented time, we may not be celebrating this year.
We knew that the museum was more vulnerable than most institutions because the whole idea of social distancing is impossible in tenements. We knew that because that was the history we told.
During the pandemic, how lucky we are to have recruited Annie Pollan back to the museum. With Annie's new energy and Annie's proven creativity, we're just so excited about the future of the museum.
Even though this is a history museum, this is not a time capsule in which history stands still. Our understanding and appreciation for history is always changing as new research is undergone. This gala allows us the opportunity to invite you into our building and also into the processes that help us build and rebuild our building over time.
97 Orchard at this point is 158 years old. And since the building was constructed in 1863, more than 7,000 people have called it home. And since the Tenement Museum opened, more than 3 million people have climbed those stairs, opened the doors and taken tours. So the passage of time and the intensity of that use have taken its toll. And so our goal with the renewal of 97 Orchard is to put the building back in service for the next 150 years.
I'm enormously excited about the process of seeing all of this work underway, of seeing the floors open, of seeing the roof removed to be rebuilt and reinforced, to see the components and bones and infrastructure of the building, kind of visible for the first way, really, I think in the museum's history, right? The last time it was sort of that open, quote unquote, might have been in 1905 when a major alteration was undertaken here to comply with the 1901 Tenement House Act.
We're in a place now where we can put literally a rigid frame inside the walls and floors of that building so that the structure, like the stories, can last for generations and generations to come.
We've seen tonight the inventive tools that architects and engineers are using to keep this building together. And it's almost like every year that passes, or every decade that passes, we need to invent new ways and new tools to keep the building alive and to keep the building preserved for the next generation. In another way, we have to come up with new ways to tell stories.
Ooh, brave Irish people,
have you guys ever been new to a place? Maybe first day of school, maybe you were new to that school. So let's go meet my friend Bridget.
The museum is always looking to represent the diversity of the building, and so it was important to tell an Irish story for that reason. The museum, as part of its research into Irish residents of 97 Orchard Street, discovered the story of Joseph and Bridget Moore, Irish immigrants who called 97 Orchard Street home in 1869. One of the documents that helped place the Moores here at 97 Orchard Street was an 1869 city directory that listed Joseph P. Moore as a waiter living here in that particular year. Interestingly, listed directly above Joseph P. Moore, waiter at 97 Orchard Street, was another Joseph Moore. He didn't live here at 97 Orchard Street, and in fact, he didn't live on the Lower East Side at all. He lived on the other side of town. He was also a waiter, but the other thing that really distinguished him in the city directory was he was listed as colored.
When I saw that information, the racial designation, I thought, what a great opportunity to have a conversation about how we find common ground between these two Joseph Moores.
As taken as I have always been with how the museum tells real stories of real people who lived in our iconic buildings, I had always felt that there was a big hole in our tapestry because we were not telling the stories of any Black Americans, any African Americans.
It's such a gift to have the two Joseph Moores, both waiters, in different spaces in the city, but both sharing the same city. And that is the truth of their lives, is that they are both there at the same moment, dealing with similar political change. And so thinking about what it meant for them to have the same name and to have a really different trajectory is really important, and a really important opportunity for the museum.
I think we'll really be able to learn something new about the stories of Irish New York and Black New York in the 19th century by looking at these stories in concert or together.
Joseph Moore is originally from New Jersey. He's from an area called Oxford Township, which is in a smaller town called Belvedere. It's in the countryside, very rural, but he also grew up in an area that had a sizable free Black population. So he was born free and had other community members in addition to his family that were born free. Most people don't realize that slavery happened in the North. And then when they do consider slavery in the North in comparison to the South, they think it's more benign. But there are examples of stories that show us that slavery was very much still traumatic and dehumanizing for African Americans. One example that we see this is through a newspaper article. In this article, there's a reporting of how even though people are free, there are people kidnapping African Americans and selling them south. The community is so small, I'm sure that Joseph Moore knew of this man who was pushed out and to go into hiding. What if one day someone potentially wrongfully accused them of being fugitive bondspeople? And so that could be also very much one of the reasons why he wanted to leave.
Someone like Joseph Moore might have had on his mind for a long time that he wanted to move to New York and be in a big city, try a different kind of job, be in a more urban setting, a place with multiple Black churches, a place where Black land ownership might be more possible.
The 8th Ward, in which Joseph and Rachel Moore find themselves living in 1870 and earlier on Lawrence Street, were part of a mixed community, but one that was filled with other Black or African American New Yorkers.
Other parts of the family that we encounter are Joseph Moore's parents, where his mother is remarried, and also his brother.
Coming to New York as part of a family group also brings some very valuable potential safety. You can share wages. You can, if there are young children, perhaps you can share childcare. The more people you have who come to a relatively unknown place together, the better chance of survival you have. And of course, this is going to be very similar to what we know about immigrants from Europe, who also try to bring family groups with them so that they can pool all kinds of resources and create a more stable place for themselves in this city. By the 1840s, you're beginning to see the really massive immigration of Irish in particular into New York. And Irish and African Americans are going to fight for the next several decades for the lowest rung of the economic ladder. New York itself is a very complicated place around the issues of race and slavery. And so immigrants coming into New York were coming into maybe a land of freedom for themselves. But that freedom, as was true for the rest of the United States, was often positioned in opposition to Black freedom.
Thinking about Joseph Moore's family and starting off, who's in the home, we have Rachel Moore. Rachel Moore is not listed with the occupation. She's keeping house, which for at this time is exceptionally rare. Most Black women at this point are working either as washerwomen, they are domestics, and they're working where most families together are working. So we know that Joseph Moore is a waiter, and in the mid-19th century, being a waiter is the top occupation for African Americans, at least African American men.
So the occupation of waiter is a very interesting one in this time period. Being a waiter is actually a relatively skilled position. The other interesting thing about waiters during this time, Black waiters, is that they actually made a really good living. By the 1850s, they were often paid more than white waiters because they had fought for those wages. When the Irish come into New York, however, they began to compete with Black waiters for these jobs. And as we move towards the Civil War, white patrons of these restaurants and fancy places began to say that they don't want to be served by Black people anymore. And so we see Black people losing jobs as waiters, even though it had been a very good job for them for a long time. By the time of the Civil War, Irish were beginning to become accustomed to, quote, the wages of whiteness. The idea, if they agreed to behave as other white people in the US and to dismiss African Americans, to see themselves as better than African Americans, they would get the psychological wage of whiteness, which was to feel superior to this group of people. And also, they would gain jobs, they would gain political access. And all of these things squeezed African Americans out of the picture, even as the nation was heading into civil war, a war that would eventually result in the freedom of 4 million African Americans.
In considering the impact of the Civil War on Joseph Moore's life and how that may have shaped his trajectory, or even whether he viewed New York City as a secure location that could be home, we know first that there starts to be more reports of tension between Irish or just even white immigrant New Yorkers and Black New Yorkers. Maybe he's dealing with discrimination. He's kind of coming into New York as the population is shifting. It's almost the calm before the storm, really, of the Draft Riots. And the Draft Riots are what really changed things. The Draft Riots occurred in July of 1863, and what this was a response to was anger regarding the unfair policies for the draft of the Civil War. With this draft, it wasn't, equitable lottery of, men over the age of 18, but instead you could pay a fee, you would not be drafted. And so as you can imagine, in 1863, this is disadvantaging a lot of white immigrants living in New York, like the Irish. And understanding why the Civil War is happening, blame got shifted to African Americans, and for that reason, that's when African Americans themselves became a target. They're watching their homes be damaged, as well as seeing neighbors be murdered for this, senseless violence. The violence had consequences that I'm sure can still be felt today, where it forever shaped and kind of altered how Black New Yorkers saw New York as a home, even those who may have been descended from the original Black New Yorkers that were brought here by the Dutch. You have Black New Yorkers taking this moment where the city cannot protect them, they are already treated poorly. They decide to leave, and some that even stay still have to consider, how can I make this home? Will this place as in New York ever be a true home where I can feel like I belong and I'm a part of this community?
That they were still there in 1869 is also significant. They had, to some degree, made their peace as best they could with what had happened in New York in the Draft Riots, and were looking to be part of the new New York.
Maybe he was one of the fortunate African Americans who did have Irish alliances that allowed him to be protected, because his neighbors are Irish or just interracial in general. He may have still been able to see these groups being able to coexist.
The 1870 census enumerations for the 8th Ward, particularly the area around Lawrence Street that Joseph and Rachel Moore called home, it records 80 Irish Black households where the husband is a Black man and the presumed wife is an Irish-born woman. It suggests just by the very fact that this community was still there in 1870, that it was stable, that there was something that was working for these families. And there may have been other sort of community institutions that centered them there. Black churches, mutual aid societies, other kinds of forms of leisure.
There are definitely dance halls and bars and other businesses that are for African Americans, that are run by African Americans. The other place that African Americans form community is through mutual aid societies, in which Black men or Black women contribute monthly fees. If you became sick, you could appeal to the society to pay part of your wages until you became better, and so you would have a little bit of a safety net to support you. These are people who had skills, who knew things. African Americans actually tended to be more literate than other groups at their same economic level. African Americans had built churches and schools. They went to night school and Sunday school to learn how to read. As a group, they really struggled to advance and struggled successfully in many ways, but whites continued to underemploy them. And that underemployment, that lack of access to jobs and occupations equivalent to their actual skills and knowledge, persisted in New York. One of the challenging things when we look at the two Joseph Moores is how different their paths to voting and citizenship were in this time period. African American men could not vote unless they held $200 in property. This was a law that was put into place as African Americans gained freedom from slavery in New York. And it was a way to limit their impact on state politics. So we have, again, another way in which African Americans' citizenship was limited in the state. In contrast, once Irish people were naturalized, became citizens, they could vote immediately. There was no problem there. They did not have a property requirement. It would be interesting to know whether or not Joseph Moore was politically active. There are African Americans who do form politically based clubs from the time of emancipation forward. They support politicians who they think are anti-slavery. Even when Black men can't vote in large numbers, they support candidates who promise to work to achieve the vote for African Americans. And those traditions continue afterwards.
In 1880, he pops back up in Jersey City. It's not his home of Belvedere, but it is New Jersey. And so that brings up a lot of questions. What happened? Did he realize that even staying here, he could not make advances or create the life that he wanted? In considering the differences and the similarities of both Joseph Moore's stories, I think one thing that bridges them together is this question of, what does it mean to be American? We have these two different individuals who show up together on a document through a shared occupation, a shared name. But in one way where their experiences diverge is where we know from the records of the Irish Joseph Moore that his family and his descendants eventually became more enmeshed and became part of New York City. We know that they were able to leave the tenements and move. And even just being able to have a record of their descendants kind of clues us into life that happened afterwards. New York never truly opened up in the 19th century for him. In some ways, it may have became more hostile than it was when he initially arrived. The Irish Moors are able to realize what one might consider the American dream, where someone who is born in the United States, born just cities away from New York City, is still never considered a citizen. We meet them in the same place, but we leave them in different respects.
New York City for the nation has often stood as the place of greatest freedom. Looking back at this period with less romance and more critical engagement can help us understand some of these pernicious and long-lasting legacies of racism. The ways in which different groups were set against each other. We're told that this country means one thing to this group and another thing to that group. And it's not to be shared. That if you succeed as a European immigrant, congratulations, and remember, do not share that success with African Americans. This idea of New York as a place to be free was very different for those two sets of groups. They did not have the same access to equality, to freedom, to citizenship. If we can be a little more critical about how that differed for these two groups, we can then begin to be a little bit more conscious about how to undo some of these inequities.
These stories don't exist separately in vacuums. They're all melded together in really complicated ways. And the opportunity to tell these stories in those more complicated ways is exciting to me.
Why is it important for the Tenement Museum right at this moment to incorporate someone like Joseph Moore? Is because we are getting better as a nation, as institutions, whether educational, university settings, or museums, other institutions, to tell an honest, holistic story about what this nation is and how we're all interconnected in all the beautiful and horrific ways that this country has brought us together. The Tenement Museum is excavating some of these important narratives of families to help us really feel connected to this larger, longer story of what it means to be American.
I think 2020, more than any other year in most of our lives, has felt like a year where we were living through history. This is an idea we talk about all the time at the Tenement Museum, but I don't think, even for me, right, it didn't hit in the same way that we are living through a moment that historians are going to look back on. What do we want to say about our current moment? What stories do we want to share for future generations? This is the work that Your Story, Our Story can offer us, a place to share for each other, for future generations, how we want our voices heard, how we want our stories told.
We're absolutely thrilled to be able to tell the story of Joseph and Rachel Moore, our first story about a Black family in the tenement. But we also realize that we can't tell the story of every single family under this roof. And so we're so excited to be able to have a website that is capacious enough to take our time-tested approach of stories, personal stories through objects, and house them together, allowing us to stitch together our connections one to another.
This collection of now over 10,000 objects, it creates a space for people to contribute their story to a broader story.
The object I chose to write about is this embroidered shawl because to me, I think the very idea of home is in what we choose to carry or remember of it. America is truly a country of every little thing in the world. So yes, the headscarf is American, the shawl is American, Chinese tea is American, everything can become American.
I think Your Story, Our Story is one of the greatest tools for educators. And as an educator, my primary identity, I think that the mission of the Tenement Museum is so beautifully encapsulated in Your Story, Our Story. That's like the foundation of my understanding and appreciation of the museum.
I think doing this project gave my students a greater sensitivity to the lives and experiences of people from groups other than their own. In some cases, it actually enabled them to learn more about the experiences in their own family.
Honestly, I came here when I was 1 year old. I don't know that much about my culture. It just opened windows to actually know where my family came from and the struggles and how they got here.
There are a lot of assumptions that students make about the people who sit next to them. I think it's a really great activity for them to see all the commonalities that they have.
My name is Vincent. I'm from Shanghai, China, and my item is a notebook. I wanted to share my story to tell people that Chinese are not that different from the Americans, but I was surprised that, people from Ireland, from South America, we share a lot of common things.
Thank you, Tori. So I first used Your Stories, Our Stories in 2016 as a pilot program at my university, and since then I've used it in about 4 or 5 other courses. I think it's just such a unique and brilliant way for 330 million people living in the United States to see how we are all sharing not the same experience, but some shared collective identity as people who have moved, bodies who have moved for either a greater life, for greater opportunities. There's just a pioneering spirit that embodies all that is America. Well, it's interesting whenever we get to the part where it's time to shake the tin can, because a lot of people really appreciate and enjoy institutions, but in many ways I think we take them for granted and we just assume that they will always be with us. We love what we learn. We love how we can see our own families in these stories or learn about new cultures. But having cultural institutions is not a given. Having cultural institutions in the midst of a global pandemic and a financial crisis, that's recession, depression for some communities, is not a given. We have to understand that if we love something, we have to contribute to it. People who care enough about this museum, whether they live on the Lower East Side or in New York City or even America, they want to see these stories continue. They want to make sure that there's another generation of young people who understand what immigration means, who understand what it means to try to become a citizen in this country, to understand the complexity and nuance of race and immigration in a country that has not always been welcoming. These are the reasons why we contribute to our cultural institutions, because to know our past is to know ourselves. To know the past of other cultures is to know ourselves. And the Tenement Museum is weaving that story in for us in ways that no other museum has done to date. And it's important for us to make sure that we can continue to do this great work.
One of the stories that Josephine Baldizzi told the Tenement Museum was how she remembered on Saturdays or Fridays being in her window and seeing across the air shaft her neighbor, Fanny Rogaszewski. She recalled how Fanny would wave to her to come over, and Josephine knew that she was inviting her to come into her home to turn on the lights because it was the Sabbath, and Fanny Rogaszewski, as an observant Jewish woman, wouldn't want to turn on the lights. And I think this is just such a beautiful story of how people not only formed community with the groups that they immigrated with, but rather in the tenements, almost precisely because of the crowdedness, they're forming important bonds of connection to those of other cultures. And indeed, those bonds of connection are helping those other cultures flourish. And I love that Josephine said that vision of her standing in that air shaft, it has never left my memory. Josephine and her family move out in 1935 when the landlord evicts most of the residents. But he does not evict Fanny Rogaszewski. She's been working as a janitor for the building. And we have at the museum her toolbox. And this is one of my favorite objects because it kind of makes us think in a more complex way about Fanny Rogaszewski. Fanny was in many ways the steward of this building, and right now the museum is the steward of the building. And just like Fanny had her tools to help her do her work, we call on you and we ask you to help us, to give us the tools to continue this very important work. Whether you send us the tools in the form of stories for Your Story, Our Story, whether you send us the tools through the making of contributions, whether you send us the tools of your support by coming to our virtual programs, all of this helps us as we move forward into the future. We cannot wait to welcome you back into this building. So we hope to see you here at 97 Orchard, at 103 Orchard, on our walking tours throughout the neighborhood, and on Zoom. So wherever you are, you have no excuse not to come back and visit your home at the Tenement Museum.
you.